Hello, everybody. This is Getrude Matshe here in beautiful Wellington, New Zealand. It is an honor and a pleasure to be presenting to you at this amazing Best of You Expo online. My presentation today is called How to Grow a Money Tree. And since we're in the inspiration zone, I thought I would share a little bit about myself as a serial social entrepreneur and share the journey that I have been on as an entrepreneur from the age of 6. I was blessed to be born into a family of entrepreneurs. My mother and my father were two of the most amazing people you will ever meet. My dad was the visionary. He was the dreamer. He could see the big picture from afar. My mother was the implementer. She was the one who got on the ground and got things done. And I remember at the age of 6, she taught me how to sew. She taught me how to crochet. She taught me how to knit. And we had to make crafts that we would go and sell to raise money for our school fees. So I was brought up in Rhodesia at a time where we had racial segregation and we were under the colonial rule of the British. And to send your children to private school was very expensive. I went to private school all my life, not because my parents were rich, but because our parents showed us how we could make the money to pay for our own school fees. So I would go with mom. My mother was a nurse. My dad was a chartered accountant who could not get a white-collar job in Rhodesia at that time. So they relied on my mother's income, and we would go to all the white neighborhoods to sell on the weekends. I distinctly remember one day when I went with my mom, we would travel on a bicycle. She would have a big basket of wares in the front, and I would be strapped on the bike at the back. And we would knock from door to door to door, trying to sell our wares. I was hungry. I was thirsty. We had left the house really early without having breakfast. And I said, Mama, this isn't working. Let's just go home. And my mother stopped the bike in the middle of the street. And she looked me in the eyes and she said to me, Getrude, you need to remember 2 things when you sell. You don't give up. We're going to knock on the next door. When you knock on the next door, that's where you'll make your sale. And like a miracle, we knocked on the next door. And this was a beautiful house. It had these big colonial pillars in the front, massive door. And the lady of the house opened the door, which was very unusual at the time because a lot of European people had servants who would do that for them. But this lady must have seen my sorry little face because she let us into the house. I'd never been in a white person's house before. And the first thing she did is she went to the kitchen and she came back with a slice of cake and a glass of juice. I still remember that cake to this day. She made me sit down and told me to eat, and she started talking to my mom, and she was asking my mother why she was selling. And my mother said, my girls go to the convent. The Dominican convent was one of the most expensive schools in the country. My sister and I were one of the first 2 Black kids in that school. And she looked at my mother really puzzled, and she said, why? Why don't you send them to the township school with all the other African children? And my mom said, because my girls need a good education. If they're educated, they will get out of poverty. I remember I was 6, but I realized that if I got an education, I would get out of poverty. And so I studied hard. I wasn't a straight A student. And out of a family of 5 kids, my parents got 4 college graduates. I learned a lot of things on that day. I'm getting emotional because my mom has just died. As we were walking home, my mother said, I need to teach you something else about people. There's 2 types of people in the world. There's good people and there's bad people. That lady was a good person. She bought everything in the basket. Not that she needed everything my mother was selling, but she realized the reason why my mother was selling, and she liked my mother. And my mom said people buy from people they like. And you have to give people the opportunity to show up and show who they really are. Don't judge anyone. So I've lived this magical life where my life plays out like a series of little miracles, and magic happens to me all the time. I meet the most wonderful people. So I went into business when I moved to New Zealand. I decided to be an entrepreneur. I was trained in IT. I was a systems analyst. I was a programmer. And when we got to New Zealand, I came out with 3 kids under the age of 12. I got a job as a systems analyst. Within 3 months, I was promoted to be a project manager. And I was responsible for computerizing the largest private hospital in New Zealand. I was invoicing $25,000 a month for my services to my clients. My annual salary was $60,000 per annum. So I wanted to renegotiate my work hours so I could work from home in the afternoon and look after my kids and go to the office in the morning. The day I approached my boss, he was in a very bad mood. This man stood in his office and said, "Gertrude, you don't have a choice. I need a full-time project manager. It's either you stay or you go." And I realized he was forcing me to choose between my children and work. And my babies are not negotiable. I remember standing in this man's office, and I remembered a quote from a book that I had read that morning. And the quote said, "If a man kicks you on the butt, let it push you towards your goalpost." Only thing I could think of. And I'm thinking, why am I thinking this? And then the penny dropped. And I realized that this was the kick in the butt that I needed for me to go into business. Like a zombie, I went to my desk, I signed my resignation letter, and I handed it in. I had my plan B. My plan B was I would go into business. I would fall back on my art. I'm a textile artist. I started painting my fabrics. I started making my batiks and try to sell my fabric all over Wellington, and the fabric would not sell. Everywhere I went, people would look at it and say, "It's beautiful, but can you paint ferns? Or can you paint fish?" I was painting zebras and giraffes and African animals, and it wasn't working. And then one night I had a dream. I dreamt of my grandmother. She came to me in this dream, larger than life, but speaking in English. She hated English. And she said to me, "Gertrude, if you have a problem, break it up into small pieces." At 2 o'clock in the morning, that dream made no sense. But when I woke up, I realized what the dream meant. And I got my scissors and cut my fabric into small pieces. I paint 6 meters of fabric. And I started making cushions. And I started selling the cushions at $25 a piece. I sold 1,000 cushions in 3 months and opened my first business, which was a small shop that sold hand-painted cushions. I created a website and started exporting my work all over to the United States and around the world. That shop didn't work as a business idea. I sat in that shop for 1 year. People would trickle in slowly, but most of my sales came off the internet. And it was simply because I was trying to sell a product in a country with 5 million people. New Zealand has 6 million sheep. So if I was selling something to the sheep, I would have made money. So I changed my tactics, took my business home, and closed the shop. But being in that shop was one of the biggest blessings I ever had because I was bored. I started thinking of other business ideas, and I hit on my first $1 million idea. My ex-husband was a doctor. And when we got to New Zealand, I saw hundreds of vacancies for doctors all over the internet. So I wrote back to Africa to some of our friends. I said, "I want to start a recruiting agency. Would you like to come and work in New Zealand?" 5 of my friends said yes. I placed 5 doctors and made $125,000 in my first 3 months of business. I ran that company for 13 years, recruiting health workers for New Zealand and Australia. I then started investing in properties, bought my first house 3 months after I got to New Zealand by ironing people's clothes. I realized that everybody in New Zealand had washing machines and dryers, and in Africa, you've got domestic servants. You have help that helps you in your home. And I thought, who's ironing all these people's clothes? I literally put an advert in the newspaper that said, "I will pick up your laundry, iron it, and bring it back." I was making $600 to $700 a week ironing people's clothes over and above my salary. So I would get my kids home, feed them, do their homework, put them to bed, and iron until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and created GM Global Investments, which was a property investing company that had about 16 homes in a space of 6 years. I then went on and reinvented myself in the film industry. So as a storyteller, I started stalking Peter Jackson when he filmed Lord of the Rings. Whenever he'd give presentations and talks, I was there. One day I went to a presentation. It wasn't Peter Jackson speaking, but one of the guys who designed the spider in Lord of the Rings, a graphics designer. And I'm sitting in the back of that room thinking, gosh, I wouldn't mind acting in one of Peter Jackson's films. So I put up my hand and I asked the question, how could I take part in one of the movies? And they were casting for King Kong at the time. And this man said to me, it's really funny, but we are actually looking for 350 African extras for one scene. And because I knew a lot of African people here in New Zealand, I'd been working with the refugee service, I decided to create a database and present it and create a casting agency. I hit the streets of Wellington with a digital camera hitting on anyone brown. I recruited Maoris and Indians, sold that database to Weta, and went into business and supplied all the ethnic extras that took part in King Kong and Avatar. As a way of giving back to my community back home in Zimbabwe, I had created the Africa Thrive Foundation, where I was sponsoring children in our village whose parents had died of HIV-related diseases. A lot of these kids were immediate family members, but it extended to the whole community, and we ended up sponsoring 350 kids in the little primary school where my ex-husband went to school. During the recession, it got really hard to fundraise, so I had to think of a way to raise money. So I created what was called Walk on the Wild Side Tours, which is a tourism company that takes people on a magical trip to Africa. You get to live in a community with no electricity, no running water, living like an African. And the last 5 days is 5-star. I take people to the Victoria Falls. We go whitewater rafting, bungee jumping, doing all of the magical things that you can do when you come to Africa. And that helped me fund my nonprofit, and it turned into a for-profit business instead. I started coaching people to write books. My company is called Black Kiwi Publishing. I realized that I was Black. I live in New Zealand. I am a Kiwi. And how could I represent that? My logo is actually a small little Kiwi bird with zebra stripes. So Black Kiwi Publishing is now another company that I own. My latest business venture that I'm really excited to share with you is called the Her Story Circle. The Her Story Circle curates the Her Story Women's Global Empowerment Conferences around the world. I launched it last year in July, had a conference in Las Vegas, one in Wellington, in Sydney. Beginning of this year, I headed out to Norway, had a conference in London, had one in New York, and then COVID-19 hit, and I had to stop and cancel 15 events. It felt as if the universe had pulled the rug from under my feet. But it was the biggest blessing because now we're having our first virtual conference, and I would like to invite all of you who are listening to come and share your stories. I believe we change the world through our stories, one woman at a time, one person at a time. So if you're inspired and you're interested to be part of our community, the website is theherstorycircle.com. So how can I summarize my presentation in terms of all of the things that I've learned from business? Number one, look for problems and turn them into businesses. Just like my grandmother said, if you have a problem, break it up into small pieces. It's now a principle I apply to everything I do in business. If I'm trying to make $1 million, I chunk it down to 12 months. How much can I make in 12 months, in 6 months, in 3 months, monthly, weekly, daily goals? The next thing I learned is how to transfer my skills. Everybody has got transferable skills. My background was in IT. I knew how to build databases. Everything I've done is built on databases. So you can transfer the skills that you have now to a completely different industry. I ended up in healthcare, recruiting doctors, but everything I did was based on my very first qualification. The other thing I learned about business is to be honest. Being honest helps you be creative. So your honesty will draw people to you. It will make you more attractive. And I'm really hoping that everything I've shared today will help empower you to connect, to collaborate, and be a part of a community like women, like us, who are out here inspiring you through this amazing conference. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic conference. Bye.